This committee will come to order. I'll ask everyone to take their seats. It is an honor to convene the organizational meeting of the Committee on Foreign Affairs for the 115th Congress and to welcome all our new members and our returning members. Now, for the members of the committee, this is the second oldest committee in the House of Representatives. Ways and Means predates us, but this committee had its origins in the Committee of Correspondence formed by the Continental Congress in 1775 and first chaired by Benjamin Franklin. Our predecessors have struggled with the questions of war and peace, freedom and tyranny, and diplomacy and development now for more than 2 centuries. This past Congress, we too tackled a number of difficult issues, including threats from Iran, Russia, North Korea, and ISIS. And we did this work together, which is reflected in the fact that this committee was responsible for 24 pieces of legislation becoming public law. All in all, we held 280 hearings, briefings, and meetings, and I am confident that our committee will continue to rise to the occasion in this new Congress. Of the major initiatives awaiting us, one of the most significant will be to authorize the Department of State, whose accounts have not been authorized for nearly a decade and a half, despite our efforts of authorizing these in the past and sending them to the Senate. Thankfully, this past year, we succeeded in working with the Senate to enact critical embassy security and personnel reforms, and I'm hopeful that this will be the year that we succeed in fulfilling our budget authorizing role, one of our most basic and important mandates. We will accomplish this and other critical tasks by working together. And one of the things I enjoy most about this committee is seeing us cooperate, harnessing the dedication and ingenuity on both sides of the aisle to address the serious challenges our nation faces. What I'll share with you is that Mr. Engel and myself, 4 years ago, when we became chairman and ranking member, agreed we would run this committee in a bipartisan way, that our members would travel together, that we would split the time equally, that we would enforce the rules, actually the rules originally written by Thomas Jefferson in terms of the decorum that we are supposed to express. It is my observation that the reason we had 24 pieces of legislation pass is because members got to know each other, listen to each other, work together, and that is the only way forward for the United States, as challenging as this world is today, is if we all speak with one voice. And we won't always agree, but Ranking Member Engel and I work hard to conduct the business in a way befitting the history of this great committee. And I strongly believe that our country's protection and prosperity depends upon our willingness to engage each other in this room as colleagues who can work together despite our philosophical differences. So, again, I really urge you to get to know each other. And I really urge you to benefit from the time spent trying to understand our varied backgrounds and interests. You can learn an awful lot by listening to people. And before asking Ranking Member Engel for his comments and member introductions, I'd like to briefly introduce the new Republican members to the Foreign Affairs Committee. After 2 years away, we are glad to have Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois returning to the committee. Thank you, Adam. Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin's 5th District brings decades of congressional experience and expertise to the committee. We have Congresswoman Ann Wagner of Missouri's 2nd District. She served as U.S. Ambassador to Luxembourg and has focused on human trafficking, among other issues. Congressman Brian Mast comes from Florida's 8th District. We thank this father of 3 for his extraordinary service to our country, having served in Afghanistan as a bomb disposal expert. We have Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida's 19th District, a former ambassador to the Holy See and successful businessman, owner of a construction company that dates to 1856. Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a former FBI Investigator of the Year, not to mention a CPA, JD, MBA, EMT, and of course, Eagle Scout. You'd have to be an Eagle Scout to have that as a career follow-up. His FBI service took him also overseas to Iraq and Ukraine. And last but not least, Congressman Tom Garrett of the Commonwealth of Virginia's 5th District brings both military and legislative expertise to this committee, and I'd also like to congratulate him on his recent marriage. So once again, a big welcome to our new members. The committee will benefit from all of your years of service to this country. And I'd now like to yield to the ranking member for his opening comments and the introduction of our Democrat members.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you in the coming Congress as we've worked together so well during the past 4 years. I'm hopeful that we will continue this committee's long-standing tradition of bipartisan cooperation in promoting our national interests. Chairman Royce and I like to say that when it comes to promoting national interests, that politics stops at the water's edge. And I'm very proud of the members of this committee on both sides of the aisle who have fulfilled that over the past 4 years that Chairman Royce and I have been ranking member and chairman respectively. And so I think it's very important that we try to continue that. It doesn't mean we're not going to have disagreements from time to time, but I do believe respectfully that disagreements can be respectful, not disagreeable. During the last 8 years, my colleagues on the majority side called the administration to task when it made a foreign policy decision to which they objected to or they thought put our interests abroad at risk, and neither did I. I think everyone knows that I'm not afraid to speak my mind when I disagree with a policy, even if my own party is behind that policy. So I think all the members on this side certainly feel the same way, and I hope going forward we keep up that tradition of speaking truth to power, putting our country's interests before our parties. And that's what it means to leave politics at the water's edge. Now, speaking of leaving politics at the water's edge, I want to just take a moment to talk about a great friend who was chairman of this committee for many years, who recently passed away, and that's Congressman Ben Gilman of New York. His portrait is to my right over there in the wall. Parts of my district are the same as Ben's district. And those of you who were on the committee while Ben was the chairman of this committee know that Ben was a wonderful person who was fair, kind, sensible, and I think Ed Royce continues in that fine tradition of bipartisanship and working with both sides. So I would just ask my colleagues very quickly for a moment of silence for Chairman Gilman. Thank you. I'd now like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce the new Democratic members of this committee. First, I'm very happy to welcome Dina Titus, who is now serving her 3rd term, representing the 1st Congressional District of Nevada, previously served 1 term representing Nevada's 3rd District. I know Dina wanted very much to get onto this committee, and I'm delighted to have her, and I think we'll all benefit from her expertise. So, Dina, welcome. Welcome to the committee. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Norma Torres from California. She's now serving her 2nd term, representing the Golden State's 35th Congressional District, and has expressed to me a desire for a long, long time to be on this committee, has a particular knowledge of Central American affairs. That's where she was born, and I look forward to her expertise in teaching us some of the things that are important. As we know, that region of the world and our country are really bound up and intertwined, and it's really so important to have someone of her expertise on the committee. So, Norma, glad to have you. Next, we're very happy to welcome back Brad Schneider, who served on the committee in the 113th Congress during his 1st term, representing the 10th Congressional District of Illinois. and was recently elected again to serve that district. Those of you who remember Brad know how smart he is and what a hard worker he is, and we're just delighted to have him back on the committee. So welcome, Brad. I'm also very happy to welcome Tom Swazi, a newly elected member representing the 3rd District of New York, out in Long Island, replacing Steve Israel in Congress. Tom has extensive knowledge, was the county executive of Nassau County for many years, and the minute he was elected, came to me and said, I really want to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I know we're going to look forward to his expertise. Tom Swazi. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Adriano Espiat, also a New Yorker, who represents the 13th Congressional District, my neighbor to the south. Our districts abut each other. And Adriano is the first Dominican-American to serve in Congress. So he's a trailblazer, and I know that he's very, very popular. He replaces Charlie Rangel in Congress. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Ted Lieu, now serving his 2nd term, representing the 33rd Congressional District of California. When we're all tired, he'll have us out to Malibu, and we'll have a very good time. So Ted, we're really delighted to have you and your expertise as well. I know we talked about Taiwan and some of the other things that are near and dear to your heart, and look forward to working with you. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we move on, and looking forward to a good year.
As am I, Mr. Engel. Thank you, and congratulations to all the new members of the committee. And thank you in advance for your service to this committee. So moving on to the organizational items on the agenda. We'll begin with the adoption of the committee's authorization and oversight plan for the 115th Congress. This is required by House Rule 10, which was sent to your offices last week, and it's included in your folders. Without objection, we will consider it en bloc with the non-controversial one-sentence amendment received late yesterday from Mr. Meeks on press freedom in the Western Hemisphere, which members also have in their packets. And this plan sets out the general intentions of the full committee, subject as always to world events, and reflects input from both sides of the aisle. This committee has oversight responsibility over the State Department and several other government agencies, and it's our job to ensure that they are operating effectively. So I'd ask if the ranking member has any comments on the oversight plan.
Well, let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank your staff for working with us on the oversight plan. It identifies many of the key foreign policy challenges that the committee will examine over the next 2 years, and it's a good document. I certainly support its adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Without objection, then the authorization and oversight plan is... without objection, the authorization and oversight plan is considered as read and adopted. The next order of business is approving the list of committee professional staff for the 115th Congress as required by Clause 9 of House Rule 10. So I want to recognize the committee chief of staff, Amy Porter, the majority staff director, Tom Sheehy, Mr. Engel's minority staff director, Jason Steinbaum, and their colleagues for their service to the committee. And our new members... Our new members will soon learn how fortunate we are to have a dedicated professional staff of such a high caliber. And without objection, the staff list that all the members have before them is approved. And finally, we will turn to the adoption of committee rules for the 115th Congress, which were circulated to your offices last week. Now, these rules are identical to those that govern committee operations during the last Congress, with one minor addition agreed between the ranking member and myself to ensure that the minority is consulted and that witnesses receive notice of any change to the title of a previously noticed hearing. Before entertaining a motion on the committee rules, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member if he has any comments on the rules.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The rules we have here are generally the rules we have used with both Republican and Democratic majorities in this House. That is not to say they cannot be improved. I understand Mr. Cicilline has an amendment, but I certainly support them, and glad that we are again continuing the traditions that you and I talked about earlier.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Engel. Does Are there any amendments? Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you,
Has
Mr.
an amendment to the desk?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
So we're going to ask our staff now to distribute the amendments to the members so that they can all read the amendment. And then we'll ask the clerk. Clerk, will you report the amendment?
Cicilline Amendment to House Foreign Affairs Committee Rules for the 115th Congress. Section 6B4 is amended by inserting at the end, a witness invited to testify as appointed by the President from civilian life shall include a disclosure form identifying any arrangement, affiliation, relationship, or substantial financial interest the witness has with any organization, company, or entity directly related to the subject of the hearing, as well as the nature of the relationship disclosed, unless the committee chairman and the ranking member determine that there is good cause for noncompliance. A witness must further disclose every instance in which he or she has registered as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
The chair reserves a point of order and recognizes the author to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and Ranking Member Engel for your leadership on this committee. It has been a great pleasure to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and offer this amendment, which is quite simple. As we already require from non-governmental witnesses, it would require a basic disclosure from witnesses representing our government before this committee so that we know whether they have any significant ties to organizations or entities that are the subject of our hearings. Furthermore, it requires government witnesses to disclose all instances in which they have ever represented a foreign government as required under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. These two disclosures will allow the members of our committee to have a thorough understanding of any interests or previous connections which may play a role in a witness's perspective on the issues on which he or she is testifying. This is not to suggest that the fine men and women who serve as appointees in any administration would be unduly influenced by outside relationships. I have the greatest respect for all of the public servants who choose to represent our country, but I believe that it's wise to require full disclosure and transparency on the part of all witnesses so that members may have a full understanding of a witness's history and background in relation to the topics on which they're being called to testify. It's true that government appointees are required to certify by law that they do not have competing interests with foreign governments, but those certifications are not public and are not disclosed to this committee, and government witnesses are not required to disclose to this committee whether they have ever represented a foreign government under FARA, information which I believe would be extremely useful to committee members. So I urge my colleagues to support this very straightforward amendment in the name of transparency and urge all members of the committee to recognize the value of learning this information before we hear from witnesses in the coming Congress. And with that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes himself. I think, just on reflection of this, this is a regrettable amendment. I've served on this committee for many, many years, and I can't recall there ever being a time when we had an amendment to the Rules Committee package, and the reason for that is because we get together a week before and we share this package, so we don't have amendments come at the last minute. And we work out before the organizational meeting that language, and that was the case long before Mr. Engel and I chaired this committee. If there is a problem that needs to be addressed, I'm pleased to do so. But of the hundreds of administration witnesses that appeared before this committee last Congress, and I think last Congress we had 120, I'm not aware of any claims of conflict of interest, nor of the hundreds that preceded that in former sessions of Congress. And I think the reason it's not an issue is because it is amply covered in existing law. Every presidential appointee who requires Senate confirmation, and every assistant secretary, every Schedule C appointee, every policy-making employee that you have at state who appears here before us has to go through the public financial disclosure requirements under the law. And all public employees are subject to criminal conflict of interest laws. So what does that mean? That means that prior to their appearance here before this committee, we have their executive branch public financial disclosure report with all of that information on it. It also means that we have at our disposal the information publicly available in terms of whether they were ever, what was the, yielding back to Mr. Cicilline, what was the terminology for, that you used in your amendment? If I could have a copy of your amendment here. Here it is. A foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. We likewise have, under the registration laws, all of that information going back over 25 years. So the Executive Branch Personnel Public Financial Disclosure Report, I have this here for Rex Tillerson, the new Secretary of State, for General Mattis, and we're happy to show you how to have at your disposal that disclosure 9 days before, or what, a week before the committee hearings. So if there are questions and you want to raise those questions, you will have a copy of any registration as a foreign agent going back over 25 years that you can bring up, and the witness will be seated right there at that desk. You can raise those issues. Any conflict of interest that you perceive out of the financial report, you can raise that. And from my standpoint, when you've got 120 government officials in front of the committee and there are disclosures in place and no one's raised a single case of concern over administration witnesses being unduly conflicted and presenting false testimony, I don't know what the problem is we're trying to solve, but what I'm sharing with you is that we have the information here, and I'll share that information with you on these points you raise. And in terms of bringing up the amendment, unfortunately, it looks like a double standard from where I sit. I'm just going to share that. But no U.S. government witness from any administration, Republican or Democratic, has ever been subjected to such a requirement. And again, when you're already subject under the law to conflict of interest and financial disclosure requirements, and it has to be made public, and we have it prior to the hearing, you've got it at your disposal. You've got it under the Ethics in Government Act, under the Stock Act, and under the other criminal and civil statutes. Criminal law prohibits administration officials from participating in official matters in which that official or those whose acts may be imputed to that official has any financial interest. So senior administration officials also have this legal obligation, as I say, to file these public reports on their finances. And in regards to Mr. Tillerson, who, if confirmed, will appear before this committee, he told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this, and I'll just give you his testimony before Senator Corker's Foreign Relations Committee the other day. When questioned, that part of my life's over. The first step I took was to retain my own outside counsel, and the only guidance I gave them is I must have a complete and clear, clean break from all of my connections to ExxonMobil, not even the appearance, and whatever is required for us to achieve that, get that in place, precisely. And that's what we expect. And so again, the issues being raised are already covered under the law. If this situation changes and we need to revisit the committee's rules, then I commit to the members to do so. But we're not in the practice of changing the committee rules absent a real demonstrated need. Do any other members?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kinsinger.
I just, since I wasn't here as I'm going over the merits of this amendment, I wasn't here obviously the last 2 years. I was just wanted to pose a question to the author, if I could, as to, did you attempt to do this 2 years ago, and what was the result, or is this the first time?
If the gentleman is yielding, I'm happy to answer. This amendment was not offered last time we were here. Had it been offered, I would, of course, supported it. This is something that I've developed in relation to a series of events that I think demand that we be particularly transparent, and if this information is in fact available, as the chairman has suggested, this would be very simple disclosure. This is not also important to recognize that the disclosure that this amendment seeks is not limited to financial disclosure, which the chairman is talking about. Those disclosures which are on file are financial.
Well,
This also includes non-financial conflicts of interest.
If I can, I'll just retain my time and just say, I think it's obvious that this is, in essence, a partisan play. And this is a very bipartisan committee, and that's why I love it so much. And so I would agree with the chairman. This stuff is very open, very accessible, and I hope we all take that into account when trying to decide whether or not, we're going to play, in essence, partisanship on a committee where we believe politics should end at the water's edge. I thank the chairman for yielding.
Mr. Chairman.
Other members? Let me recognize the gentleman from California.
Great. I will yield my time to Mr. Cicilline.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to just first say I regret that that anyone has seen this as a partisan issue. We were, I think, in a bipartisan way 2 years ago, strengthened disclosure requirements for non-governmental organizations.
We did.
And in the same way we strengthen that, I think we can do the same thing for government witnesses. So I implore my colleagues not to see this as a partisan issue, but as I hope an issue that both Democrats and Republicans can agree, that our constituents deserve the right to know as we assess testimony and assess the perspective of witnesses, that we have good information and thorough information as to whether or not any arrangement, affiliation, or prior relationship might color in any way their testimony or their perception. And while the chairman has made reference to financial disclosures, this amendment is more than financial. These are non-financial conflicts that might arise as a result of arrangements, affiliations, or relationships. The notion that because this is available in some limited context as it relates to finances, that we shouldn't have this information in a broad range of potential conflicts, there's no harm in knowing that. If there are no conflicts, then I presume most witnesses will say there are none, and we'll accept that. But if there are, we ought to know that. And I don't think the sharing of that information, the disclosing of it, impugns anyone. It just says we should have this information so that when we are making determinations on how to weigh testimony, that we know what might contribute to certain perspectives, certain viewpoints, and what prior relationships might exist. I think, we talk a lot around here about transparency and making sure that we are operating free from conflicts of interest. I think those are important values. This amendment simply requires a very simple disclosure. As the chairman has said, my guess is that most of the witnesses will say there are none. But in the event there are, we ought to know that.
And I think, in one sense, Mr. Cicilline, I think there's a valuable contribution in raising the argument in the sense that many of the members probably did not know that under the registration with regard to foreign agents under a Foreign Agents Registration Act, that you can go back and get this information that's objective, or back over 25 years, and find out if people have ever had,
For
that financial tie, or that you can go through these statements and get them a week before and pore through them and find any financial tie. So the question is, if things become so vague, how could a witness know, on the question of a tie that's not financial? The subjectivity here, the lack of objectivity. What I'm sharing with you is we will make available, and you have at your disposal, the tools, I think, to get to the crux of this problem without getting into an area so vague. And I would just add one other thing. Let me let you
I just want to say finally, Mr. Chairman, that the question may be one of burden. It seems to me that the burden properly rests on the testifying witness to make these disclosures and shouldn't rest on the members of the committee to conduct their own independent investigations, particularly with limited resources. We have financial reports that will show conflicts as it relates to financial conflicts, but we don't have the ability to develop or research or investigate any other potential conflicts as a result of an affiliation, a relationship, or other arrangement. And so I think the question really is, if we all agree this information is important, the committee has a right to know it, then it seems to me simpler to put the burden on the party that has the knowledge, that's the witness, rather than put that burden on members of a committee to search this out. And so I urge my colleagues to support what I think is a very simple amendment that will not be burdensome to witnesses. They'll presumably know this about themselves, but I think the American people and we as individuals who have to evaluate that testimony ought to have a sense and a clear understanding of any of these potential conflicts.
Mr. Issa, I think, was seeking recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to inquire a little detail on the amendment. Is this amendment intended to be for as many years back or only current relationships? It appears as though it would be open-ended, that if I traveled to my grandfather's birthplace in Lebanon and sold 10 square meters of land 30 years ago, I might have to disclose it. Is that the intent? I'd yield.
If the gentleman, yes. The amendment, I believe, uses the language "has," so it means current arrangements, affiliations, relationships, or substantial financial interest. So it doesn't, a relationship that has concluded or an affiliation or a arrangement that has concluded would not be covered. It would be for current arrangements, affiliations, relationships, or substantial financial interest the witness has in the present tense.
If I, reclaiming my time, if I could make perhaps a constructive suggestion, we're going to have many, many witnesses under the committee rules. Of course, we get notice of who those witnesses are. If the chairman were to commit to have questions like this made available to any and all witnesses in which we had supplemental questions like, do you have that, with the witness prepared to answer it, then we might serve both purposes, which is put them on notice that this question may be asked, but at the same time not require an extensive addition to a form that would be, if you will, non-standard to the many other committees. Would that be of interest to the gentleman in order to essentially be able to query a witness knowing that this question is before them? And I would yield.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for the question. I think if this question were posed to witnesses before the hearing, because obviously an answer to this question can have an impact on the questions you ask or the perspective that we may take in our line of questioning, that's the whole point of putting it in the rules, so it happens ahead of time. To find out after the hearing or to use your 5 minutes to get this question answered, it seems to me unfair. Let's get this information ahead of time. If it's in a written form from the chairman and the ranking member that we then get a written response to, that's fine. I think it could be satisfied in a number of different ways, but just getting the information to the members of the committee before the witness actually testifies, I'm certainly open to the process by which that happens.
Yeah. And then if I could yield to the chairman for just one more question. In my prior committee work, we often did allow both sides to provide, if you will, interrogatories to witnesses with an expectation that they often would answer them in writing, but they often would not answer them in writing, but they were on notice that those questions might be before them. Is this consistent with what the chairman would envision to resolve this ambiguity?
Yeah, I think the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, raises a point here. The committee members here can offer whatever questions we would like to have answered. I have suggested that in this particular case, this particular amendment is so vague, but we have at our disposal first the ways for you to facilitate now any objective past connection, and you have at your disposal the way to submit those questions. So that being the case, I would also just point out that no U.S. government witness from any administration have ever been subjected to such a requirement as you've added here, and no other committee has this requirement in its rules. And so I think the suggestion Mr. Issa makes is a good one that allows you to follow up with whatever questions you'd like to submit in advance without us burdening every single 120. Anyway, I see another member seeks recognition. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to speak in support of this amendment. And I just make a couple of observations. First of all, the fact that no other committees require this doesn't mean that it's not a good idea and doesn't mean that perhaps they should. That's first. Secondly, the suggestion was made earlier that somehow there's some partisan intent to this, as if transparency is a partisan issue. I don't think anyone in this committee believes that transparency is a partisan issue. I believe that everyone in this committee believes that providing the maximum amount of information for this committee and for the people we serve is the goal that we should have. And so, to that end, to say that we don't need to ask our witnesses to provide this information, that we can either ask these questions at our hearing or we can dig into public records to see what other information is out there, isn't just a problem for those of us who think that the transparency should be what guides this committee and its witnesses. It's a problem for the people we represent. I don't want, and I don't think the people that I represent want to have us ask questions about witnesses and their connections to the subject matter of our hearing. If there is a way to get that information beforehand, I would think that we would have an interest, and certainly the American people would have an interest in knowing whether those commitments or any sort of interest that they have exist before the witnesses get here. It's going to, I think, affect the way that the process works. Why wouldn't we, and I guess I just finished with this, when it's suggested that there's some question as to how the witnesses can know the answer to this, I think it's fairly obvious that there's no one who can answer these questions better than the witnesses. Why should we have to wait until they're here to ask them? Why should we have to conduct our own investigations? Why not ask them in the nature of full transparency? That's what the American people expect. And I just finished where I started. I know that none of my colleagues on the other side of this dais believe that full transparency is, and seeking full transparency and the benefit of more information rather than less is somehow a partisan issue.
Would the
I know
gentleman
they
yield?
don't agree with that.
The gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to.
I thank the gentleman for you, and I'll be brief. But I think the reason that many of us would suggest that this is a partisan issue is the fact that for the last 8 years, an amendment like this has not been offered from the folks on that side of the aisle. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Well, I would respond that I'm sorry that no one thought to seek out this full transparency during the past 8 years, either from our side of the aisle or from your side of the aisle, frankly. We would have been happy. I'm sure Mr. Cicilline would have been thrilled to have had this discussion 8 years ago instead of today. But the fact that we haven't done this in the past doesn't mean that it's not a good idea. Frankly, if that's the way Congress acted, that we were stuck only doing things the way we've always done them, things will look very different around here than they do. When there's a good idea that will lead to greater transparency and more information from the American people to know who's coming to testify before this committee, I don't think this is a tough issue. I think this is a fair amendment. It's what I think our constituents would expect us to do here, and I know again that there is broad bipartisan support in this committee for working together, and I think working together to provide this kind of transparency is what we ought to do.
And with respect to objectivity, what we have is the ability now to pull up the entire history of any financial connection, anything objective. We have the capability today to go back with electronic form and pull up in real time, and certainly a week beforehand, from the Foreign Agents Registration Act, any example of any type of conflict like that. And on top of that, we have the ability to question in advance if we have some reason, but to do something maybe in a way that is not so vague, not so subjective.
I do, Mr. Chairman. I think I had a minute left, and I just wanted to.
Yeah, I yield back.
And I just wanted to address that. I don't disagree that we can do that, but I would respectfully suggest that anyone who's watching this hearing, who knows that there are two choices, two paths we can pursue here. We can pursue a path that lets members of this committee conduct full investigations into filings that have been made and to submit interrogatories, that's one path. or the other path is to simply ask our witnesses whether there are any connections to any of the subject matters that they're going to be talking about, and have them provide that answer. It seems fairly obvious that the easiest path is to simply ask the people who are going to be here to provide that information, rather than requiring us or our constituents to start digging through records or to offering interrogatories, which certainly none of them can do as well. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to strongly associate myself with your comments about the vagueness of the language. And I would ask, you know, and I think my other colleagues will have pointed out that this was not offered in previous Congresses. I would not vote for this if this were going to lodge against a Hillary Clinton administration or Barack Obama's administration. I think it's got surface appeal, surely, but it is all-encompassingly vague. So I would ask the sponsor, if a witness unwittingly fails to disclose a non-financial relationship or a non-financial arrangement, what is the penalty for noncompliance? And secondly, how do you define relationship or an arrangement? A contact, a meeting? Where is that in the plain text of this amendment as to how you would define such? I mean, if I have a conversation with Liliana Ross-Layton, and we do have a longstanding good friendship, but would that conversation constitute a relationship of some kind or an arrangement? With financial disclosure, there's a bright line of demarcation as to what we're talking about, and even there you say substantial financial interest. You know, perhaps all financial interest should be part of that. But again, unwittingly failing to disclose doesn't put on the book that would have to be provided in some cases about a life of contact. What's the penalty? What happens to that witness? Do define, if you will, arrangement and relationship. What constitutes a relationship?
If the gentleman's yielding, I think there is no suggestion in the rule that an unwitting failure to disclose carries any penalty. We expect.
Oh, wait, whoa. If the gentleman would yield.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought he yielded me to answer a question.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't think there is any suggestion that an unwitting omission is subject to any penalty. We expect all witnesses to answer this question in good faith and to be providing information consistent with their best memory. I think with respect to affiliation, relationship, and arrangement, those terms have their ordinary use and their ordinary meaning. I think certainly if this amendment passes, and we think it's important to give additional clarifications as we ask witnesses to comply with the terms of it, we can do that. But I just return to Congressman Deutsch's question. This is really about which path we take. If the chairman's suggesting that you will get this question answered and your staff will provide the disclosures that relate to answering this question prior to witness, Democrat or Republican, testifying before this committee, that achieves the same objective. But I do think the question is, what's the path by which we collect this information and share it with the committee of every witness, Democrat and Republican? And requiring the person who has the best knowledge about it, the witness,
very briefly,
to disclose it.
You know, this says a witness invited to testify as appointed by the president from civilian life. So that's the very limited universe of people we're talking about in terms of the application of this amendment. And again, if this were being offered and Hillary Clinton was the president of the United States, I can tell you my opposition to it would be just as strong. It is vague, as Chairman Royce has so eloquently said, and it also, I think, could have a chilling effect, and there's surface appeal. This looks like transparency, but it's anything but. So I yield.
If the gentleman would yield. So the concept here is that you would, if I could explain this, you could have a relationship with an entity. If you ever had a relationship with an entity, and if your interpretation is different, this is the vagueness I'm getting to here. It's a violation of the Federal False Statement Act. Now, I can understand why you might want to, with an individual, ask a certain number of questions. But for 120 witnesses that we're going to pull up here, to intentionally use something that vague in your terminology
Mr. Chairman,
I don't know if
requesting-
you're like me, trying to go back through every conversation you've ever had with any ambassador.
It doesn't do that, Mr. Chairman. It's whether
I read
you
it.
currently have. It's not have you ever had. The language of the amendment is arrangement, affiliation, relationship, or substantial financial interest the witness has with any organization, company, or entity directly related to the subject of the hearing. So you're not required to go back and of any prior relationships. It's whether the witness currently has anything that would involve a relationship, affiliation, or arrangement with the current subject matter, entity, or organization subject of the hearing. It's quite limited. There's no ambiguity. It's not to search from your high school days. It's whether you currently have a conflict or a potential conflict.
Let me suggest that if you want to ask that question, you can ask that question, whatever question you'd like to ask, but to take something and try to fashion it, which is so vague that as I'm running these scenarios through my head, it seems to me almost designed to make it impossible to be precise in the answer to that question when we're asking about broad subject areas. But if we want to answer it, fine. But the bureaucracy of putting it out there for every 120 witnesses that we have come before us seems to me quite an impediment to the work of this committee, especially when we've suggested ways in real time, because it took me all of less than a minute, I think it was probably 20 seconds, to get the Secretary of Defense's and the Secretary of State's information, and then not long to go through it. These are questions you can ask in advance, as I've suggested. But putting that kind of vague language into the rules would not serve us well in terms of our interest for the committee. Anyway, the chair withdraws the point of order. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, was seeking time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll call for the question.
All right. Let me first go to Mr. Engel, who I think was requesting time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And very briefly, I want to repeat something that Mr. Cicilline said, which I think is very important. I support Mr. Cicilline's amendment, and he made the point before that I think should be made again, is that we already have a provision in our rules that requires disclosure of conflicts of interest for non-governmental witnesses at our hearings, and I think it's reasonable to apply the same standards to government witnesses. That's all he's trying to do. So therefore, any of the witnesses would have the same standard, not just one standard for non-governmental witnesses and one for governmental witnesses. So I support Mr. Cicilline's amendment. I don't think it will be difficult to implement, and I think it's always better to have more rather than less transparency, and I yield back.
And in conclusion, I just mentioned that the criminal conflict of interest statutes on the books for decades address these issues in very clear, adjudicated terms. There's no known problem that this would solve, but we still have the capacity to ask these questions and all other questions that you would seek to ask of our witnesses. With that said, hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on adopting the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
No.
the chairman votes no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen? Ms. Ross-Lehtinen votes no. Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. McCall? Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Cook? Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. Yoho? Mr. Yoho votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Donovan? Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mrs. Wagner? Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Sherman? Pardon me, Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks? Aye. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Serres? Aye. Mr. Serres votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Keating?
Aye.
Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Barra?
Aye.
Mr. Barra votes aye. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel votes aye. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mr. Castro? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mrs. Titus? Mrs. Titus votes aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres votes aye. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye.
Were any members not recorded?
Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Mr. Rooney?
Mr. Rooney votes no.
All members have been recorded. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 20 ayes and 25 noes.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Hearing no further amendments, the chair now moves that the committee adopt the committee rules for the 115th Congress. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the committee rules are agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the committee rules and authorization and oversight plan. This completes the business required by the House rules. I thank the members, and I look forward to working with all of you in the weeks ahead to contribute meaningfully to the foreign policy of the United States. The committee stands adjourned.